I was going through my storage cupboard and I found this model of the Bounty, the famous mutiny ship. I've no idea how long it's been there. It's dated 1971, so I suspect it's been there for quite a while. Here's the instruction sheet, and everything seems to be here, so I thought it might be fun to put it together and we'll see how we go. I thought because the kit that I've got is so old, it's probably a collector's item and worth a lot of money. So I had a look on eBay and I found that there's actually two different kits. There's the one that I've got, which is from 1971. It's a 1 in 110 scale, and the other one is a bit later, and it's a 1 in 170 scale. But either way, as you can see, they're not worth a lot of money, probably no more than they were when they were new. If we have a look at the instructions, it tells us that the kit is a Revell. It's actually from 1971, and it's made out of styrene. In the first step is to assemble the components onto the deck, but before you do that, they recommend that the individual parts are painted the colours that are suggested. For instance, this piece here is black. If we look at the instructions again, the first step is to cement into part A, which is the deck, 2 of part 2, and part 2 is the forward fife rail. So what we need to do is take the deck off so if we just snip in there and we snip down here, and there's the deck. Now these nibs are going to have to be cleaned up, and now we need to find part 2. So the deck is part 1. Now this has got numbers on each of the parts, and here's number 2 on this one. It's this one here. We can get that off gently, and it's this one here, which might not be so easy to get off. Oh, yep. This is very dangerous. So, children, you should get mummy to do this bit for you with a sharp knife. Fell off. And the other job that we can do is to clean up these. So I'm just going to use my little file there and here. So now I think we're ready to glue the fife rails in. So the critical thing here is to not use too much cement, because it will melt the plastic. So carefully pop him in there, And then the other side. Pop him in there. And we can put that aside now to harden. I can hear some of you out there saying, what's a fife rail? So I've looked it up, and it says that a fife rail is a design element of a European-style sailing ship used to belay the ship's halyards at the base of a mast. It's one of a dozen or so types of rails often found on such ships. Fife rails are typically horizontal strips of either wood or iron and are joined and fitted to the tops of a series of stanchions. The term apparently derives from the location where the ship's fifer would sit and play his fife as they heaved up the anchor. Of all the ships that have sailed through history, few have had so much written about them as the H.M.S. Bounty. Bound on a seemingly peaceful mission of transplanting breadfruit trees from Tahiti to the Virgin Islands, the Bounty became the stage on which was acted one of the most famous mutinies in maritime history. The Bounty was not designed as a man-of-war, but rather was built for the merchant service, and later was assigned to the Royal Navy. Her carrying capacity made her ideal for the trip to the South Pacific. She was launched as the Berthier, but was renamed Bounty when she went into naval service. Her tonnage is given as 215, her length as just over 90 feet, and her beam was 24 feet. She sailed on her fateful voyage from Spithead on the afternoon of November the 28th, 1787, with Lieutenant William Bligh in command, but contrary winds in the Channel forced a return to port, which put the sailing date off until the 23rd. Bligh, a strict officer, excellent and experienced navigator, lost no time in making clear to the crew of 45 men that this was to be no pleasure cruise. He immediately cut the rations of bread by 1/3. This, he said, was because of the uncertainty concerning the length of the voyage. Other rations, however, remained the same. Bligh had also made provisions for the entertainment of the crew. He set aside time after 4 o'clock each evening for entertainment and dancing, feeling that, quote, some time for relaxation and mirth is absolutely essential, close quote. However pleasant this might seem, there were already the seeds of discontent in evidence. On the 30th of November, Bligh ordered a case of pork opened before sailing, and had sent pork as well as cheese to his home. He, however, at this time held the crew responsible for the petty thefts. This was the first of many incidents that led to the final mutiny that took place on the 28th of April, 1789. The Bounty had, after many months of hard sailing and several floggings of crew members, made port at Tahiti on the 26th of October, 1788. Bligh was not aware that the breadfruit trees could not safely transplanted at that time of year. He therefore could do nothing but wait for the time to arrive. This was, of course, not too hard for the sea-weary crew to take. The happy and easy life of this island was as close to paradise as many of them would ever get, and they made the most of it. Here they remained until April the 4th, 1789. At sunset on the 4th day of April, the Bounty made sail and left Tahiti. The breadfruit trees had been loaded, and Bligh was headed for the Virgin Islands, where the trees would be unloaded. The crew was reluctant to leave the island, where they had been treated royally, and where they had all made friendships that were hard to dissolve. Once at sea, troubles again arose between Bligh and the crew. Bligh ruled with a heavy hand. Rations were cut, more floggings, and the seamen yearned for the peaceful charms of the island that they recently left. Just before sunrise on the 28th of April, Mr. Fletcher Christian, master's mate and acting lieutenant, along with several other seamen, went to Bligh's cabin, awakened him and forced him to deck. Here they announced that the ship had been seized and was being taken back to Tahiti. It was decided that Bligh and all that were faithful to him were to be put out in the Bounty's launch, given some supplies, and allowed to take their chances with the sea. Little hope was held among the castaways that they would ever see land again. They did not, however, reckon with Bligh's determination. He had vowed to bring the mutineers to justice. Thus began one of the most outstanding voyages in all the history of the sea. 41 days later, and after having covered 3,618 miles of open water, Bligh brought the battered launch into harbour at Timor, which is an island off the west of West New Guinea and northwest of Australia. Of the 19 men who had been set adrift, 12 eventually reached England. Certainly a determination of bulldog tenacity and a high degree of ability on part of Bligh, to whom the total credit must go for the success of the trip. The mutineers sailed in the Bounty on a course southwest and arrived at the island of Tuburai, about 450 miles southwest of Tahiti. They found the natives here very hostile, and a course was set for Tahiti, which was reached on the 6th of June. Christian, who had taken command of the vessel, was still anxious to settle on one of the outer islands, and made plans to take the boat to sea as soon as possible. Having taken on supplies, the Bounty again sailed for Tuburai, where Christian was determined to settle. When they arrived on that island, the second time, the natives were more friendly, and the mutineers went ashore and began to construct a fortress. However, unrest amongst the crew, as well as trouble with the natives, sent the boat again back to Tahiti. From here Christian took the ship and what were left of the faithful followers and sailed for whatever sanctuary they could find. Christian, who was perhaps the only one who really appreciated Bligh's abilities as a navigator, was aware that there was a good possibility that Bligh would reach England. He was also aware that Bligh would surely be back to bring in the mutineers, if he did manage to get to England. He therefore was anxious to settle in a place far off the normal paths of ships. Christian sailed from Tahiti on the 23rd of September 1789 with 28 people aboard the Bounty. This group comprised natives, men and women, as well as what was left of the Bounty's crew. They did not know their destination. For that matter, the world had no knowledge of what did eventually happen to the Bounty until February 1808, when an American ship, Topaz, reached the remote Pitcairn Island, and the final chapter of the Bounty unfolded. Most of the mutineers died violent deaths on Pitcairn, some of the hands on the natives, some by the hands of their comrades. One man of the crew survived until 1829. The Bounty was burnt to escape discovery at Pitcairn on the 23rd of January 1790. Thus ended the turbulent history of one of the sea's most famous ships, H.M.S. Bounty. For a little more detail on the Bounty, the ship had bluff bows and a pleasing sheer, that is, the forward and aft rise to the decks. Bounty's design was very similar to the Whitby colliers used on Captain Cook's expeditions. She was slightly smaller than H.M. Bark Endeavour from his first expedition. She also had a flush, that is, a continuous weather deck, compared to Endeavour's raised forecastle and quarterdeck. Forward, the head rails led to a figurehead of a woman with a riding hat, which was fully clothed, which was a rarity, retained from her civilian service. Restrained decorative elements included badge-style quarter lights, looking very much like small bay windows, and 5 lights spanning the stern transom. The Admiralty installed an armament of 4 4-pounder cannon, and 10 half-pound swivel guns, which could be mounted atop posts sighted along the gunnels. And the next item to be installed is the mizzenmast fife rail, two of those, that one and that one. For some reason they don't have a cross piece on either side, but that will fit in there like that. So we'll glue those in. The next piece to attach is the capstan cap, which is this bit here. Snipping off. There have been many books and movies made about the mutiny on the Bounty. The three highly successful books of the incident: number 1, Captain William Bligh's The Mutiny on Board H.M.S. Bounty; number 2, Nordolf and Hall's Mutiny on the Bounty; and number 3, Robert Huff's The Bounty. Likewise, there have been 3 highly successful movies based on the incident: Mutiny on the Bounty from 1935, starring Clark Gable and Charles Laughton; Mutiny on the Bounty 1962, starring Marlon Brando and Trevor Howard; and The Bounty 1984, starring Mel Gibson and Anthony Hopkins. Each movie follows its source book to some extent. Likewise, each movie digresses from its source book in some instances. All the movies have one thing in common: they give a much more important role to Fletcher Christian than do any of the books. Not surprisingly, each movie features a popular matinee movie idol of the time. The ship used for the 1935 movie was an existing ship that was re-rigged to look like Bounty. It wasn't a reproduction. The first reconstruction of Bounty was commissioned by MGM Film Studio for the 1962 film Mutiny on the Bounty. She was the first large vessel built from scratch for a film using historic sources. Previous film vessels were fanciful conversions of existing vessels. Bounty was built to the original ship's drawings from files in the British Admiralty archives, and in the traditional manner by more than 200 workers over an 8-month period at the Smith and Rewland shipyard in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. To assist filmmaking and carry production staff, her waterline length was increased from the original 86 to 120 feet, and the beam was also increased. Rigging was scaled up to match. While built for film use, she was fully equipped for sailing because of the requirement to move her a great distance to the filming location. On the 25th of October 2012, the vessel left New London, Connecticut, heading for St. Petersburg, Florida, initially going on an easterly course to avoid Hurricane Sandy. Shortly after, the ship sank due to loss of power. The pump stopped working and the crew was inexperienced. The second replica of Bounty was built in New Zealand during 1978-79 for a film project that initially did not materialise. David Lean, the filmmaker, had planned a massive 2-movie project about both the mutiny and the aftermath. This ambitious project aimed at a more accurate depiction of the events, and part of that involved a new replica. The ship had wooden cladding over a steel hull and frames. Modern construction methods meant that she could be built at a non-specialised shipyard in New Zealand, Wangari Engineering Company. She would be built to updated safety standards and would be easier to maintain than the wooden ship, compared with the traditional built 1960 replica. This Bounty was actually a more authentic reconstruction. The hull was 240 tons burthen, which was only slightly larger than the original. Ornamentation at the bow and stern was also less elaborate. Like other replicas, she was fitted with engines, in this case 2 8-cylinder Kelvin diesel engines. The Bounty, sometimes called Bounty 3, can be distinguished from the 1960 replica by her natural wood sides, with a blue band above deck level near the stern. The deck furniture and inboard details were also left as natural wood. The steel hull came from Australia and the wood on the hull sides was locally sourced. With the steel hull, she had no need for copper below the waterline. Copper sheets protect against worm boring, whereas the 1960 replica was originally rigged with full 3-mast ship rig. This smaller vessel was set up as a bark, which in the 18th century usage means she had no mizzen top galleon yard or sail on the aft mizzenmast. After years of ongoing discussions about the films and inquiries about selling her, the ship did finally get a chance to serve in her intended role in the 1983 Dino De Laurentiis produced Hollywood film The Bounty. It was an adaptation of the original project. This film starred Anthony Hopkins as Lieutenant Bligh and Mel Gibson as Fletcher Christian. Following a brief layup, she was refitted in Vancouver, Canada, and attended the Expo 86 there. Her highlight was a participation in the 1988 First Fleet reenactment, which saw 6 other ships set sail from Plymouth, UK, to retrace the route that the first fleet of ships bearing colonists had taken 2 centuries before to Australia. Years later, Bounty was based in Darling Harbour and was used for excursions and chartering. Continued appearing in various films and television projects. She was often located close to the replica of the bark Endeavour. Both vessels, small bark rig converted British merchant ships from the same general period, have very similar paint schemes. Bounty has a flush deck and a more elaborate bow with headrails and a figurehead. At the stern, Bounty has projecting lights at the quarter badge, which are the bay windows. Endeavour is bigger, tubbier, higher set vessel with a stern raised far enough out of the water that she has room for stern chaser gun ports beneath the stern windows.
Oh, I see that duck.
You can see a duck?
I see that duck out there. I see that duck out there. I see that duck.
Out in the garden?
Out that garden.
Now, look Andy, we're going to put a little bit of glue on there, a little bit of glue on there, a little bit of glue on there, and a bit on there. Put the glue back, and then this goes in here like this. See that?
I can see that.
You can't see it. See that?
I can.
You can see it.
I can see that.
Can you see it close up with the magnifying glass?
Yeah. You put it on top.
We'll put it on top. Whoop! This part isn't ready yet. That goes on top there, like that. But it isn't ready to go on yet. Nearly ready, but not yet.
Oh.
The deck has to be fitted into the hull one side at a time. During Cook's famous voyage of exploration, the British Admiralty were not yet consistently copying the hulls of their warships, so Endeavour Replica also has a distinctive band of white anti-fouling paint just visible around the waterline. In 2007, Bounty was sold to HKR International and wound up as a mostly stationary attraction at the Discovery Bay Resort in Hong Kong. There she is called Chi Ming, a rough Chinese equivalent to Bounty. 5 years after the 2012 sinking of the other Bounty replica, this ship reportedly is in poor condition and decommissioned and sold to a Thai firm. There is one other recreation of the Bounty, which is possibly the most accurate of them all. During the mid-1950s, Walt Disney asked his team of theme park designers for a recreation of the Columbia Rediviva, which was the first American ship to circumnavigate the globe. There was no accurate plans available for this ship, so instead they used the plans for the Bounty. The visible differences between this replica and the original Bounty are fairly minor. The most obvious distinguishing feature is that Columbia lacks the ornamental quarter badges, the small bay windows like projections on either side near the stern. Columbia's bow are also simpler decorative headrails. Just after the projecting catheads that secure the anchors, the ship's rails on either side are also more built up than the Bounty's. The Columbia replica is armed with a few swivel cannon along the rails and 4 smaller cannon which are very similar to Bounty's 4 4-pounders. 2 of these cannons are installed further aft near the taffrail, another difference with the Bounty. Inboard, Columbia has her capstan fitted way forwards near the windlass and the gleaming brass ship's bell. A very good likeness of the Bounty has been delighting Disneyland visitors for almost 65 years. So, what do we know about William Bligh? He was probably born in Plymouth in 1754. He died in 1817. He was the son of a customs officer. He joined the Royal Navy in 1770, and after 6 years as a midshipman, he was promoted to sailing master on the Resolution and served under James Cook on the great captain's third and final voyage to the South Seas. After returning to England, he married Elizabeth Betham, with whom he had 4 daughters and twin sons who died in infancy, and entered private service as a commander of a merchant ship in the West Indies. The Bounty voyage was undertaken at the request of Caribbean plantations owners who were seeking as subsistence food for their slaves. The English botanist Sir James Banks recommended feeding them Tahitian breadfruit. Despite performing well on the Resolution, Bligh felt that his contribution to the expedition had been overlooked after the death of Cook, and he had great ambitions to command a brilliant scientific expedition of his own. He took a drastic pay cut when he re-entered the Royal Navy and was bitterly disappointed not to have been promoted to a post-captaincy for the expedition. Finally, he chose to serve as both captain and purser, a position that gave his preoccupation for financial matters would prove tragic. Of course, the trip to Tahiti ended with the mutiny on the Bounty. Upon learning of the mutiny, the Royal Navy dispatched the Pandora to Tahiti, where it captured 3 mutineers. Bligh himself put back to sea in the Providence in 1791, determined to complete his mission. However, it was a fatal choice for his public reputation. He was not in England for the trial and execution of the mutineers, and accusations about his command went unanswered. In his narrative of the mutiny, published a few months after his return to England, Bligh argued that the hedonistic delights of the South Seas were the cause of the mutiny. Christian's brother Edward, a professor at law at the University of Cambridge, replied in a pamphlet that interviews with the Bounty crew revealed many flaws in Bligh's command. The abolition movement, which also had no sympathy for the exhibition, circulated a journal of boatswain mates James Morrison, which contained very damning stories of his former captain's extravagant behaviour. Bligh received several other commands, served as Governor of New South Wales from 1805 to 1810, and was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1811 and Vice Admiral in 1814. His courage, navigational skills, and intelligence cannot be denied. He was commended at the Battle of Camperdown, 1797, by Lord Nelson, and performed well at the Battle of Copenhagen in 1805. Bligh never overcame a fatal inability to control his relationships with his men. While he was captain of the Director, his crew took part in a mutiny of the fleet at the Nore in the Thames estuary in 1797. In 1805 he was court-martialed but acquitted for abusive language. In 1808, while Governor of New South Wales, his bad relations with the New South Wales Corps helped spark the Rum Rebellion, during which Bligh was arrested by his own military officer, Major George Johnson, and kept under guard for a year before being sent home by his successor, Lieutenant Colonel Lachlan Macquarie. It was not the extravagance of Bligh's physical punishment that caused problems, but his mode of inflicting them. He was not physically violent. However, he was verbally and personally abusive and given to extravagant, aggressive gestures. Even worse, he violated the privileges and privacies of the sailors relied upon to counterbalance naval discipline and rigours of naval life. Ironically, for a captain who had been the subject of countless plays and novels, Bligh never learned to manage the theatre of command. Overview of where we're up to so far. Bowsprit and spritsail yard. Upper headrail and cathead. Fore fife rail, windlass. Longboat. Main fife rail and bilge pump. Capstan. Mizzen fife rail. Ship's wheel. Gun carriages. Tiller. The bowsprit is lashed to the top of the bow or the knee of the head to oppose the lifting action of the forestays. The lashing is called gammoning. Fletcher Christian began his naval career at a late age, joining the Royal Navy as a captain boy when he was already 17 years old. The norm was 12 to 15 years old. He served for over a year on a third-rate ship of the line, along with his future commander, William Bligh, who was posted as the ship's 6th lieutenant. Christian next became midshipman on the 6th-rate post ship H.M.S. Eurydice, and was made master's mate 6 months after the ship put to sea. The muster roll of the H.M.S. Eurydice indicate Christian was signed on for a 21-month voyage to India. I've decided that I don't like the colour of the hull, so I'm going to repaint it, particularly because the gold line down the side of the hull doesn't stand out well enough with the hull painted gold. The ship's muster shows Christian conduct was more than satisfactory because some 7 months out from England he had been promoted from midshipman to master's mate. After Eurydice had returned from India, Christian was reverted to midshipman and paid off from the British Navy. Unable to find another midshipman assignment, Christian decided to join the British merchant fleet and applied for a berth on board William Bligh's ship Britannia. Bligh had himself been discharged from the Royal Navy and was now a merchant captain. Bligh accepted Christian on the ship's books as an able seaman, but granted him all the rights of a ship's officer, including dining and berthing in the officers' quarters. On a second voyage to Jamaica with Bligh, Christian was rated as ship's second mate. In 1787, Bligh approached Christian to serve aboard the Bounty to transport breadfruit from Tahiti. Bligh originally had intention of Christian serving as ship's master, but the Navy Board turned down this request due to Christian's low seniority in service years and appointed John Fryer instead. Christian was retained as master's mate. The following year, halfway through the Bounty's voyage, Bligh appointed Christian as acting lieutenant, thus making him senior to Fry. Following the mutiny, Christian travelled to Pitcairn Island. The American seal hunting ship Topaz visited Pitcairn in 1808 and found only one mutineer, John Adams, still alive, along with 9 Tahitian women. The mutineers had perished, had however already had children with their Tahitian wives. Most of these children were still living. Adams and Maiti claimed Christian had been murdered during the conflict between the Tahitian men and the mutineers. According to an account by a Pitcairn woman named Jenny, who left the island in 1817, Christian was shot while working by a pond next to the home of his pregnant wife. Along with Christian, 4 other mutineers and all 6 of the Tahitian men who had come to the island were killed in the conflict. William McCoy, one of the 4 surviving members, fell off a cliff while intoxicated and was killed. John Adams gave conflicting accounts of Christian's death to visitors on ships that subsequently visited Pitcairn. He was variously said to have died of natural causes, committed suicide, become insane, or been murdered. Much has been made about the mutiny and what happened with Christian and the other mutineers. There have been a number of movies and books written on the subject, but not so much has been recorded about the trip that Bligh took to Timor and ultimately back to England. So let's have a look at some of the facts. During the events of the mutiny on the Bounty, 3 boats were launched. First, the jolly boat, which was found to be rotten through with worm and would certainly have sunk. Then the cutter, which also leaked and simply would not hold the large number of loyalists who preferred to go with Bligh. And finally, the launch. When Bligh had been forced into the launch together with 18 loyalists, the freeboard remaining was less than the length of a man's hand. The boat was designed for a maximum of 15 men and for short distances, not for 19 men with belongings and supplies and destined to sail close to 4,000 miles. 18 men had joined Bligh in the Bounty's launch, most of them not from any personal loyalty to Bligh, but from their loyalty to the Crown and the wish to have a chance to return to England. On board the Bounty remained the 7 loyalists who had not found room in the overcrowded launch, and Christian with 17 mutineers, 11 of whom had played an active role in the mutiny. The launch had very little in terms of provision of water on board. This was not because Christian wanted that the men would perish. It is clear from the accounts that the general assumption on board the Bounty, as well as on the launch, was that Bligh would sail to the nearby Tongan Islands, specifically Tongabatu, but there wait for an English ship. If that had not been the case, the mutineers would not have shouted sarcastically, "You will not need any arms where you're going, you will be among friends," when Bligh asked for muskets. The sarcasm was a reference to Bligh's order that the shore parties at Numoko not use their arms when dealing with the friendly islanders, nor would the mutineers have objected to Purcell, the carpenter, taking his tools along, and have feared he would build a ship with them, if they had thought the launch would head for Timor. The fact is that the launch had full provisions for only 5 days, but that was more than enough to reach Tongabatu. As to navigational equipment, Christian gave Bligh his personal sextant, and there was a compass, a quadrant, tables used for latitude and longitude, in addition to a timekeeper on board. Without detracting from Bligh's extraordinary achievement on the open voyage that lay ahead, it should be mentioned that Fryer could probably have performed the same feat, and probably some of the other men on board also. Bligh set course for the island of Tofua, 30 miles distant, an active volcano, as it is to this day. He hoped to obtain provisions there, since what he had on board the ship launch was totally inadequate for 19 men on a long voyage. He finally found a cave in the steep cliffs that marked the shore and sent out provisioning parties. The stores obtained were meagre, and the natives who'd gathered in increasing numbers grew more hostile by the hour, partly because Bligh had made the incredible blunder of telling him that he had been shipwrecked. The natives could see that the men were practically defenceless, having only 4 cutlasses between them. They attacked the men and barely made it to the boat. The natives tried to haul it to shore. At this point, with magnificent bravery, Quartermaster John Norton jumped out of the boat and ran up the beach to unfasten the line. He was killed in the attempt, and while the rest of the boat's complement escaped miraculously by throwing out pieces of clothing which the natives in the faster pursuing canoes stopped to pick up. For the much of the voyage, the weather was cold and stormy, with copious rain and with high seas breaking over the stern, making it necessary for the men to constantly bail for their lives. The slightest inattention by the helmsman would have meant immediate disaster for them all. In the end, however, the rain weather may have saved them, because they certainly did not have enough water on board at the outset to last through the voyage, even when minutely rationed. On this voyage, the men in the launch became the first Europeans to ever sail through the Fiji Islands. Bligh marked all the islands they passed, trying to chart them and give them positions as best he could. So well did he succeed with this chart that the Bligh Islands, as he called them, could be used for navigation today. Bligh had heard from some Tongans that the Fijians were cannibals, so he did not dare land on any of the lush inviting islands. On one occasion, however, the launch was pursued by Fijians in fast-sailing canoes and almost overtaken. Death by starvation was a constant threat, the rations served twice daily being only 1/25 of a pound of bread and a gill, which is a quarter pint of water, with occasional additions of half an ounce of port and a tablespoon of rum. Although a fishing line was always out, no fish was ever caught. Towards the end of the month, the launch reached the Great Barrier Reef, where the men were more dead than alive. Finally staggering ashore on a sandy islet which Bligh called Restoration Island on Cape York, many of them could neither stand nor walk, and they still had 1,300 miles to sail in order to reach Timor. Bligh and his 17 loyalists were safely inside Australia's Great Barrier Reef. Reading Bligh's account of the open voyage from Tofua to Timor, one gets the impression that there had been little dissension on board, even though the men had undergone incredible hardship. But Bligh was always careful to omit any reference to incidents where he may not have appeared in the best possible light. According to John Fryer, the sailing master, Bligh was a tyrannical in his temper, and in the boat as in the ship, and his chief thought was his own comfort. Be that as it may, now when the immediate perils of the voyage were over, at least for the time being, trouble broke out. In fact, Bligh was faced with another mutiny. On the islet which Bligh had named Sunday Island, Purcell the carpenter had been gathering clams under the impression that it was every man for himself. When he returned to camp with his catch, Bligh proclaimed that all victuals would be considered common property and demanded that Purcell hand over his clams. The latter refused, whereupon Bligh called him a scoundrel, adding, "If I had not brought you here, you would all have perished." Purcell replied, "Yes, sir, if it had not been for you, we should not be here." At this, Bligh again called him a scoundrel. "Purcell, I am not a scoundrel, sir. I am a good man as you." This enraged Bligh, who considered the statement mutinous. He grabbed a cutlass and told Purcell to take another and defend himself. At this point, Fryer, the sailing master, gave an order to the boatswain, "Mr. Cole, arrest both these men." The situation was critical for Bligh. He could have lost his command right then and there. Eventually, however, Fryer and Purcell backed off when they saw that the captain was determined to preserve his authority and die in the attempt. If they had not given up, Bligh would have been in a weak position. There was a strong anti-Bligh faction amongst the loyalists, consisting not only of Fryer and Purcell but including the quartermaster, Linkletter, and 4 others. In fact, Bligh was so unpopular that he could not have counted on supply from any of his loyalists, except possibly for the botanist Nelson and the sailmaker Lebong, and there were the weakest conditions of them all. Again, Fryer's recollection of the affair was quite different. In the words of his daughter Mary Ann, "The fact is, Purcell had in some way offended Bligh, and as usual gave way to his ungovernable passions. He drew his cutlass, swearing at the same time he would kill him. My father wrested the weapon from him to prevent bloodshed, and for this he was forever to have both hated and feared by Bligh." After another 2 weeks of extreme suffering, Bligh and his crew finally reached Kupang in Dutch settlement of Timor. It is characteristic of Bligh's pedantry and compulsive insistence on protocol that even though several of his men were dangerously close to dying, he insisted on hoisting a distress flag and waiting for permission to land. And when the boat finally docked, Bligh's petty vindictiveness again showed itself. He commanded Fryer to stay in the boat to guard it, as if there was anything to guard. Bligh and his 17 loyalists spent the month regaining their strength in the Dutch settlement of Kupang. And now, when the perils and privations of the journey in the open boat were over, the same troubles surfaced as earlier in Tahiti, and also on the islands with the Great Barrier Reef. Discipline disintegrated to the extent that Bligh again found it necessary to issue written orders, as he had during the last months on Tahiti. According to Alexander McKee, who wrote H.M.S. Bounty 1962, Parcell the carpenter told Bligh to his face that during the boat voyage he had seen him frequently drop a piece of bread while serving out the rations, and afterwards, when he thought no one was looking, picked it up and popped it into his mouth. Linkletter, one of the quartermasters, backed Purcell up. He too had seen Bligh conjuring an extra piece for himself. Bligh retaliated in his customary service way. Within 24 hours he had picked on Purcell and Linkletter and had them imprisoned on board Captain Spikeman's ship. Captain Spikeman was the first officer to greet and help Bligh and his crew on their arrival at Kupang. Fryer, the sailing master, was again insolent and disrespectful, and according to Bligh, had even told his brother-in-law, able seaman Tinkler, to stick his knife into coal. Being anxious to get to Batavia, now Jakarta, 1,800 miles distance, in time for the departure of the Dutch October fleet for Europe, Bligh bought a 34-foot schooner for 1,000 Rix dollars and named it H.M.S. Resource. At Norton's death on Tafua, there had been no further casualties on the long voyage, but now the tropical fevers of Indonesia started taking their toll. David Nelson, the botanist, succumbed to an inflammatory fever. Others were to follow. They sailed for Java, having had a good 2 months to recuperate from the extreme privations on the open boat voyage, from Tafua to Timor. Because of the danger of attacks by pirate, they were escorted by 2 armed proas, Indonesian sailboats. Bligh and his loyalist crew were sailing westward on the schooner Resource on their way from Kupang to Batavia. The term loyalist may be an euphemism because Bligh again faced a mutiny, albeit a minor one. Having reached Surabaya, in Dutch settlement on the north coast of Java, Bligh ordered Fryer, the sailing master and Bligh's nemesis, to take the Resource and meet him in the harbour at a point to which the governor of the district was going to take Bligh in the official launch. However, when the captain and the governor reached the place at the appointed time, the Resource was nowhere to be seen. Bligh, livid with rage over the embarrassment, finally found his snugly moored at the quay. He demanded to see Fryer. When Fryer appeared, Bligh heaped upon him more of his usual abuse, and the seamen who were standing around agreed, "Yes, by God, we are all used damn ill, nor have any of us right to be used so," at which point Bligh grabbed a bayonet and arrested Fryer and also Purcell, who had been the most vocal of the complainers, and had them put in irons. In Surabaya, Fryer had also accused Bligh of fraudulent dealings at Kupang, but he later retracted his allegations. After apologising, Fryer was released when the party reached Semarang, but Purcell, who refused to apologise, was kept prisoner until the ship arrived in Batavia on October the 1st. On October the 1st, 1789, Bligh and his men arrived in Batavia in the Resource. Purcell, who had been in irons ever since the stopover at Surabaya, was now let free. On the following day, Bligh fell ill with malaria, an ailment which would haunt him for the rest of his years, and from which he suffered especially during the second breadfruit expedition. The Resource was sold at auction on October the 10th, as was the launch. On October 16th, accompanied by his clerk Samuel and his servant John Smith, Bligh left for South Africa on the Dutch packet Vide. Before their departure, Seaman Thomas Hall died from tropical disease. The other crew members were left in Batavia to arrange for passage in various Dutch ships. Many of them were ill. A few were dying. If Bligh had cared for his crew for any other reason than to keep them in effective working order on board, he would have seen to it that his sick was sent home first. Bligh spent the month of November on the Indian Ocean on his way from Batavia to Cape Town. He certainly did not like being a passenger, at least of all in a Dutch ship. His journal is full of contemptuous and sarcastic remarks about the Dutch methods of navigation. Meanwhile, the tropical diseases in the Dutch East Indies were wreaking havoc with the loyalists he had left behind to wait for transportation home. David Nelson, the botanist, had died. Seaman Hall had died in Batavia before Bligh left. Now it was Quartermaster Linklater and his mate William Efferston turned to succumb to the violent fevers. Seaman Robert Lamb died on the passage home, and the acting ship servant Ledward was never heard of again. The likelihood is that he was on board the ship Welfare, which was lost without a trace. Some botany scholars, however, think he died in Batavia. Others that he survived and is identical to a surgeon also named Ledward, who allegedly was on George Vancouver's ship Discovery from 1791 to 1795. His letters from Batavia was preserved, and it gives an excellent insight into Bligh's pettiness and meanness. The word mean here was equivalent to stingy or ungenerous. The captain denied me, as well as the rest of the gentlemen who had not agents, any money unless I would give him my power of attorney and also my will, in which I was to bequeath to him all my property. This he called by the proper name of security in case of my death. I hope this matter will be clearly pointed out to my relations. Eventually, only 12 of the 19 men set adrift ever reached England.
There once was a ship that put to sea. The name of the ship was a Billy of Tea. The winds blew up her bow, up down, oh below my bully boys blow. Soon may the Wellerman come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. She'd not been 2 weeks from shore when down on her a right whale bore. The captain called all hands and swore he'd take that whale in tow. Soon may the Wellerman come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. Da 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 da. Before the boat had hit the water, the whale sail came up and caught her. Hands to the side, harping and fought her when she dived down low. Soon may the Wellerman come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. No line was cut, no whale was freed. The captain's mind was not of greed, and he belonged to the whaleman's creed. She took that ship in tow. Soon may the Wellerman come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. Da 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 da. For 40 days or even more, the line went slack, then tight once more. All boats were lost, there were only 4, but still that whale did go. Soon may the Wellerman come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. As far as I've heard, the fight's still on. The line's not cut and the whale's not gone. The willow man makes his regular call to encourage the captain, crew and all. Soon may the willow man come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go. Soon may the willow man come to bring us sugar and tea and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, we'll take our leave and go.
I am sailing home again, across the sea. I am sailing stormy waters to be near you, to be free. I am flying, I am flying like a bird across the sky. I am flying past
Here we are, finally finished. And here's quite a few hours of my life that I'll never get back. If you've watched all of this video, there's an hour of your life you'll never get back. You might notice that we're a bit short of crew on this ship. I don't know whether they've all died from scurvy, or perhaps they've just gone below for their lunch. Hopefully that's the case. Here's one brave soul climbing the rigging, probably ready to set some sail. Here's another chap, probably on anchor watch. There's the officer of the watch and the helmsman, and a lookout, conscientiously scanning for pirates. And that's it, until you join me for the next project.